we're on activity 30, and still in the section on constitutions. The point of letter A is to just kind of remind us that the Constitution of the United States, and any constitution, is not something that we obey. It's something that government obeys, and I just wanted to remind us that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And so, whenever you're reading the United States Constitution, just remember that this is we, the people, speaking directly to our government and telling our federal government what it can and cannot do, and in certain places our state governments what they cannot do. In letter B, again, just reminding us that we are addressing government, and I said in a previous video, the bottom line is we are giving government enough power to protect us and do what we need it to do, but making sure that it's not going to use that power to harm us. So we are telling Congress, for example, or the federal government, some things it can do, and limiting its power so that it can't use its power to harm us. And in certain places, we're speaking to the state governments. For example, in the third bullet there, "No state shall enter into any treaty," so that we're speaking to the state governments there. So to summarize it, we're speaking to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution always, unless it explicitly says we're talking to the state governments. Letter C is there, talking about how the U.S. Constitution was ratified, to remind us that when 55 or so, however many people were at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, when they wrote that document, it was just a piece of paper until it was ratified by the people of the United States. So again, the Declaration says that the just powers of government are derived from the consent of the governed. So for the powers of the U.S. government to be just, it would have to be by the consent of the governed through the ratification process. So you can see here that as soon as 9 states had ratified, the people of 9 different states, it would be in effect for those states. They had no power to bind the people of other states, but for whoever ratified it, it would be binding on them. Letter D was a quotation. This is from Article 5, and it's a description of the amendment process. A lot of you in your assignments didn't get this quite right, and that's why I wanted it to be here, because I think it's worth emphasizing that the federal government cannot increase its power itself. The federal government is not able to increase its own power, and that makes sense because if you think back to previous activities, when I emphasized that for the founders, the governments were potentially dangerous, and there was an evil side of governments that needs to be kept in check by a constitution. You wouldn't want that evil beast of government to be able to give itself power if the Constitution is a kind of chain or leash on government. You don't want government to be able to extend its own leash, because then it could get close enough to harm you. So if you read the amendment process closely, the federal government can propose to expand its powers, but it doesn't become a part of the Constitution until 3/4 of the states agree through ratifying it. And notice it's only through the legislatures. It's 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and the federal government, so it's the representatives of the people, and then again the legislatures of the states, 3/4 of them. So the federal government cannot expand its powers legally, constitutionally, unless it gets the consent of the American people, both through Congress and through the state legislatures. In Activity 31, I want to introduce the concept of federalism. I'm going to use a diagram that I'll probably bring out a few times for the remainder of the course. It's a kind of rectangle with the U.S. Constitution as the highest authority in this system, and we've seen before that in Article 1, Section 8, the American people assign or delegate certain powers to the federal government, and these are here in this smaller rectangle, and it says the understanding is that all other powers of government are reserved to the state governments. That's represented in this larger rectangle here, and that's confirmed explicitly in the 10th Amendment. So let's look at Jefferson and his understanding of the Constitution. And he is pointing out that even in his day, especially for people who are foreigners, who he's assuming did not have an accurate understanding of our system, he says that foreigners suppose that the state governments are under the authority of the federal government, and he emphasizes this is not true. What you get is exactly what I've said, that some powers are assigned to the federal government, others are reserved to the states, and they are side by side in authority, and we'll explore them more as we go through this activity. But he says that when you put them together, you get a whole. Some essential powers of government we've assigned to the federal government, such as defense is in the hands of the federal government, and others the powers of government in the states. And when you add those together, you get all powers of government. And let me just emphasize, I begin the activity with a definition of federalism, and this is precisely what federalism is. It's a division of power between the federal and state governments, and we do that by assigning some powers to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution, especially Article 1, Section 8, and other powers are reserved to the state governments. And one is not under the other in authority. They're both under the authority of the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution is not part of the federal government. It's something separate from the federal government, and the federal government is under its authority.